Good afternoon here on the East Coast of the United States, good evening in Europe, and good early morning in the Far East. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council. We have a terrific event for you today, 2 panels and numerous keynote speakers to talk about global security, and especially Moscow's aggression in Ukraine, and how we help Ukraine defeat Putin and establish itself as a secure and stable state, fully aligned with the West. We will begin with pre-records from Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who's been a beacon of strength promoting sound American foreign policy to deal with the danger to the United States posed by a clearly revisionist Kremlin that has identified the United States as its principal adversary, and a growing superpower, China, and how those two work against us. We will also have, after that, a pre-record from General Wesley Clark, who's been a very active participant in the debate on American policy in Europe and beyond, and a former SACEUR. And with that, we will have the pre-record from Senator McConnell. Thank you.
Mitch McConnell, and I'm glad to join the important conversation you're having today. The focus of this gathering, an age of marching authoritarians, is one of urgent importance, recognizing the threat revisionist powers pose to Western peace and prosperity should already be the price of admission to any serious conversation about U.S. foreign policy. But the challenge we face today is graver than the sum of its parts, and we acknowledge Russia's aggressive neo-Soviet imperialism, Iran's unprecedented promotion of proxy violence, and China's breakneck race to expand its sphere of influence and challenge the prevailing rules of the international system. Then we also have to grapple with the ways these adversaries reinforce one another, how the world's autocrats are training, equipping, backfilling, and covering for one another's aggressive gambles, and how the simultaneous threats they pose to the free world compound the challenges before us. Of course, acknowledging the threat is one thing. What matters most is what we're prepared to actually do about it. War in Ukraine may have woken up most NATO members to the harsh reality of Putin's ambitions and the urgent need to strengthen the alliance's Eastern Front, but to stop there would be to miss the point. The lesson of Russia's war of conquest isn't limited to the acute deficiencies of European arsenals or the urgent requirements of helping Ukraine win today's fight. The lesson allies need to take away is the cost of chronic neglect for hard power and high stakes of the simultaneous global challenges we're already facing. As you all know, last month the Senate passed an overdue emergency supplemental investment in both the defense of vulnerable allies and partners and our own arsenal and defense industrial base. Congress should have approved this investment sooner, but the administration's hesitation has hampered the West's response, limited Ukraine's capability, and tempered political support here in America from the beginning of Putin's escalation. It's time to move at the speed of relevance, not the speed of bureaucracy. It's time for the administration to put supplemental assistance in action and stop micromanaging Ukraine's use of American weapons. We need to equip Ukraine with the tools to win, not just enough to avoid losing. But our work doesn't stop there. That's why I've been urging the President and colleagues in Congress for years to start making a greater sustained investment in the sort of hard power capabilities and industrial capacity we'll need for long-term strategic competition we're facing from emboldened authoritarians. And as I've been taking this same message to our friends in Europe and beyond, I'm grateful to frontline NATO allies who've dug deep to equip Ukraine's defense, and I'm encouraged by the commitments larger European powers have made to surge defense spending and restock their own arsenals. But anyone who still sees the requirements of collective defense as a matter of special funds or emergency supplementals is again missing the point. The task before us is to reflect the magnitude of the global challenges in our military requirements, force, planning, constructs, and base budgets, year after year after year. That's why this summer's Washington Summit will be so important. We'll convene with new allies who have already modeled investment in capable militaries and in defense industrial capacity. NATO is already stronger with Sweden and Finland in our ranks, but this summer we'll also need to reach a greater shared understanding that spending 2% of GDP on defense and 20% of that on modern equipment and weapons cannot be an end goal. These targets have to be a baseline from which we keep building together. NATO is the most successful military alliance in human history, but we're staring down a constellation of challenges to Western security unlike any we've seen before. Anyone who doubts Russia's revisionist aims, Iran's unchecked confidence, or China's serious ambition does so at their own peril. Just as Asian partners recognize the ways Russia's war in Ukraine impacts their own interests, Western allies must recognize the importance of stability and security in the Indo-Pacific to our own interests. The order underpinning the peace and prosperity we've enjoyed for decades is not going to uphold itself. The rules of the road will not enforce themselves. The test we're facing is the test of the West's resolve. It's as simple as that. So more than ever, it's time to stand firm, to stand together, and to start matching the scale of our commitments to the size of the challenges that we face. And that work, as is so often the case, begins right here in Washington.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to participate virtually in this very important meeting to discuss the future of NATO. I want to suggest that we have to approach this question of NATO membership for Ukraine historically. And to do that, I think we have to go back to learn the lessons that Allied statesmen took from the Second World War, namely that aggression cannot be tolerated and the aggressor cannot be appeased. We learned during the 1950s and 60s and 70s that deterrence requires that the aggressor face incalculable risk. And that means he's unable to plot a safe course to his aims. And this is what provides deterrence. Today, the fighting continues in Ukraine, and this may be our last chance at this summit to be able to use the diplomatic strength of NATO to deter further Russian actions in Ukraine. And by saying that, what I mean is that we have to establish a positive path for membership for Ukraine in NATO, not when they're ready, not when the fighting stops, but a positive path now that says, here's the membership action plan. Here's the plan to go forward if the fighting continues. Here's the plan if the fighting doesn't continue. But to accept the reality that if we put NATO on the line for New Ukraine, we have the best chance of deterring further Russian aggression in Europe and for halting Russian aggression in Ukraine. And to recognize that if we back away from this time with another nondescript sort of saying that Ukraine will at some point, maybe make it into NATO, what we've done is thrown away one of the most important tools of diplomacy that could be used to stop aggression in Europe. That's the message. I hope we can find the right language and persuade the right decision makers. You know, in the post-Cold War history of the United States always stood up to prevent aggression. President Harry Truman took action in South Korea in the summer of 1950. President Nixon even articulated this in the Manila Doctrine in 1971, that we would help those nations defend themselves and fight for freedom if they will fight for themselves. And certainly there's no better case than that. President George H.W. Bush said about Iraqi aggression in Kuwait, this will not stand. And we made that happen. So that's the record. If we believe in American exceptionalism or the value of Western democracy, then we have to recognize the enormous stakes that are confronting these Western states, our states, at this moment in history. There's never been a time in human history where so many people have enjoyed so much freedom, so much prosperity. And we attribute that not only to the democracy, the industrialization, the technology, but to the fact that statesmen stood up against aggression. This is the moment. We need our statesmen to stand up and put forward a positive timeline path for Ukraine's membership in NATO. Thank you.
A big thank you to Leader McConnell and General Clark for so aptly framing today's discussion. Hello and welcome to our audience here at the Atlantic Council and our audience joining us online. I'm Andrew Denieri, resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, and I'll be moderating our first panel today, which is the strategic danger to NATO, the West, and the U.S., the Russian revisionism, and the authoritarian challenge. We have a little bit less than an hour to lay all that out for you all, so we're going to be as efficient as we can here. We'll have a moderated discussion and then launch into audience Q&A. And before I introduce our panelists, I'll mention to our audience here at the Council and on Zoom, YouTube, and social media that please submit all your questions to askac.org, askac.org, and then they'll come to me from your Twitter fingers to my iPad right here, and I'll pitch them to our panelists. And with that, I'll introduce our esteemed panel here. We have my boss, Ambassador John Herbst, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. We have Žygimantas Paviljonis, member of the Lithuanian Seimas and head of the Foreign Affairs Committee there. And Dr. Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis. And finally, joining us online, Christian Karl, who is a former editor of the Washington Post's opinion section. And with that, Ambassador Herbst, the first question to you. You've written and spoken very frequently about the Kremlin's broader goals to undercut the liberal international order and the wider implications of a Russian victory in Ukraine, not only to the region, but also to the United States. Can you detail the Kremlin's larger plan for its war in Ukraine and the challenge that it poses to security beyond Ukraine?
Putin and his team have not hidden Russian intentions. They want to have, at a minimum, political control of Ukraine. And they've also made clear in various statements and documents submitted in the run-up to the big invasion, their desire to have comparable control across the entire space of the former Soviet Union, which just happens to include, 15 other countries and 3 members of NATO. So it's clear if we want to give a boost to Putin's broader ambitions, we will let him win in Ukraine. And note my phrasing, let him win in Ukraine. I don't have any doubt that if the collective West, led by the United States, gave Ukraine all the weapons necessary, and other assistance too, because certainly economic aid is critical at this moment, Ukraine would be able to defeat Russian troops on the battlefield. The success they had in their summer of 2022 counteroffensive Ukraine had would be replicated in the future. Last year's counteroffensive was not a great success on land. And you go back, you'll see me saying that in March of 2023, because we did not arm Ukraine for success. The weapons they needed to make that a success are not quite the same weapons they need now. But if we declared a policy of victory for Ukraine and armed Ukraine and provisioned Ukraine, they can do this by cutting off Russian supply lines to Crimea. Now again, if we don't do that, if Putin were to win in Ukraine, he would suddenly have Ukraine's large resources. And senior Russian officials like Patrushev have not hidden their interest in those resources with which to take further steps west, including, I can't say for certain, but the odds are not low, against our NATO allies, especially in the Baltic states. Now, the damage of this to American interest is not limited to Europe. There is a team, as Senator McConnell put it, of marching authoritarians, principally with Russia, China, which of course, unlike Russia, has a real economy and in the long run is a more dangerous adversary. And then to a lesser but still real effect, Iran and North Korea. And if we want to put more wind in Iran's sails so they can use their proxies in Yemen, meaning the Houthis, or in the Levant, meaning Hamas, let Putin win in Ukraine. And if we want to increase the odds that Xi doubles down on werewolf diplomacy, which the Chinese adopted when they decided after the Great Recession of 2008 that we were a declining power, let Putin win in Ukraine. That's why, and this is very important, for those would-be savants who say we don't have the ability to deal with Chinese in South Pacific, Southwest Pacific, and Russia in Europe. If that were true, why do the leaders of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan insist that the best way to stay Xi's hand at the Taiwan Straits is to deal a decisive blow to Putin? Absolutely right. So let's keep the would-be savants in the think tanks world as opposed to the policy world and adopt a policy which serves American interest. So I think this whole concept of the liberal world order is true, but Americans like things in concrete terms. You want to ensure American leadership, you want to ensure American prosperity, and maintain American security with putting American lives at risk, defeat Putin in Ukraine.
Let's talk about concrete terms and the concrete threat posed by Moscow's aggression. Mr. Pavlionis, you're joining us all the way from Lithuania. You're here in Washington. In many ways, Lithuania has a front row seat to the perils of Kremlin aggression. You have a border with Belarus, of course, the Kremlin's client state. Lay out for us why Russian aggression is such a real and present danger to Lithuania and your neighbors in the Baltics.
Well, nothing new is on the Eastern Front. For 1,000 years, Russia is advancing because they have no borders, and that Putin repeats. Each new Tsar of Russia, they were occupying one another country. So it's not so much about Russia, it's about you. It's about Washington. In a very blunt way, whether Russia took the Washington or not. It's about isolationism, it's about your fatigue, it's about your appeasement. It's about leaders like Roosevelt, who was, he was so angry on fascism, but he was not so angry on Russian communism. And he, sacrificed us in Yaltas. It's about reset policies. It's about Bucharest, that actually, and it's about Putin's speech in Munich 2007 that was taken for granted in Washington, D.C. and in most of European capitals. And so to make it kind of concise, when Washington is accepting that Russian logic, we die. And now I came here as not only former ambassador in America, I came here as European who worked very hard to create a consensus among all European capitals to move all in Ukraine. In June, actually, in 1 month, we should start accession talks with Ukrainians. When when Europeans are deciding it, it's serious. So we are opening the way Europeans did with Central Europeans and the Baltics. This is the way of prosperity. This is the way of moving it all in. We have, Ukrainian supplemental done on the Hill. We have F-16 arriving. The only missing part is Washington NATO Summit and American leadership, because there is none. This is against appeasement. What I saw in Vilnius NATO Summit, to be honest, and I am still shocked, American administration was standing with Orban and Chancellor Scholz. So I was in Bucharest NATO Summit with Ambassador Dan Fried and others. I saw that picture once, but it was Germany and France blocking Ukraine and Georgia from NATO membership. Then I saw Russian troops moving in Georgia in 2-3 months. Already then, we didn't punish Russians for nothing, and so it's continuing like nothing happens. Though we are calling Washington Summit a historic, but we are absolutely not drawing any historic lessons. So I'm appealing to Americans, and I will repeat it like I'm now for 3 days in Washington. In each meeting, guys, you have a historic opportunity. Russians are not taking European capitals anymore. Europeans saw enough. They understand if we do another Munich 38 decision, kind of another Chamberlainian policy, we go to full-scale war with our own bodies and with our own territories. And now it's a choice of Americans. Either Washington Summit is becoming Munich of 38, or it's becoming Casablanca of 43. When your leaders met with European leaders and you decided to annihilate the aggressor. Aggressor that is today creating an axis of evil at the global scale, where American and European interests are challenged in every centimeter. I'm just back from Georgia. That's happening there. Those Hungarian models are spreading everywhere. Russians are everywhere. They're in Africa, they're in Latin Americans. And if Americans at the highest level at historic summit sends a very powerful signals that despite Europeans are committed and moving it all, the only real capital that is doing nothing is Washington. So be sure that you will have new wars in new regions, be it Caucasus, be it Balkans, be it Taiwan Straits, I don't know, but it's not even invitation, it's not even temptation, it's invitation for autocracies to attack American interests. Because you want this. You are inviting your weakness, your appeasement is inviting autocracies to test the limits, how far we can go. Georgian Dream is testing your limits. They will soon imprison all liberal democratic elements in Georgia, and if you do nothing, if you do not sanction them, so you are allowing it. And Russians are doing the same. They see you made a decision in Congress, it's nice, but if you are not inviting Ukraine to NATO in Washington, between the lines, you are inviting them to attack Ukraine and annihilate it.
You are making my job as moderator very easy, because I was going to ask Dr. Polyakova about the same thing, and actually something you said, Ambassador Herbst. If Russia is allowed to win in Ukraine, what might that look like? How might that embolden our adversaries elsewhere in the world?
I'll try to add to what my colleagues have already said. I think the global consequences are not just profound, they're incredibly dangerous. It's correct that it's interesting to see our Japanese allies. We had the Prime Minister here in Washington quite recently, and he addressed the US Congress, both houses. And what did he talk about? He talked about Ukraine. And I think when you hear our allies in the Indo-Pacific, who are, of course, deeply concerned about China's continued incursions in their own region, they are worried about China's own growing repressive capabilities. But what are they talking about? They're not talking about China per se. They're talking about the precedent-setting nature of what would happen if we saw Russia prevail in Ukraine. And I think the conversations we're having now ahead of the summit, leave a lot to be desired, to say the least. I think the way that the summit is being framed is the 75 years of NATO celebration, a big party of unity that we're going to throw for ourselves as an alliance. And certainly there's lots of things to celebrate, new members, Sweden, Finland. But if we don't have a future vision for the alliance, if we don't have a vision of what an alliance that is anchored in Ukraine looks like, it will be another disaster. At a time when, of course, the situation on the front lines in Ukraine is deteriorating. We have to be very honest about that. Because we had such a long, dithering delay in the U.S. supplemental bill that finally got through Congress, and systems and weapons are moving into Ukraine. But that was a detrimental delay to Ukraine. Can Ukraine win? Yes. But if you imagine the optics of a battlefield that is very much being contested, where Russians are bombing Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, where they're continuing to murder civilians and commit horrible human rights violations while we're celebrating the alliance and its ability to deter Russia, those are really bad optics. And I would hope that certainly the U.S. administration and our allies want to avoid that. But how do you do that? Well, one, I think we have to reframe the conversation about whether Ukraine is ready for NATO and ask whether NATO is ready for Ukraine. Because Ukraine now has the most advanced, battle-tested military force in Europe. I think every European here knows, and most Americans also know, that Europe benefited a huge amount from its peace dividend. That era is over. And the kind of depletion we've seen in European defense capabilities are not going to be replaced in 1 to 2 years. So I think Europe is asleep. I think the alliance is asleep. And an alliance that was awake would be on a war footing, because the Russians are spending more than 50% of their budget on military and defense expenditures. They are forming deeper, closer relationships with Iran, North Korea, with China. This is not a can we can kick down the road. And so I think we have a real historic opportunity, as Zygmantas has laid out, at the NATO summit, and it would be a real shame to squander it. I'm not sure that is the perspective that is shared across all the allies or across the U.S. administration, however.
Thank you. Mr. Carroll, I want to bring you in here and give you the chance to comment on what's already been said, but I also wonder if you can give us a picture about Kremlin aggression at home. I mean, you were the editor of Russian dissident Vladimir Karamazov for a while, and I think it would be interesting and instructive to this discussion if you could talk about how the Kremlin also treats opposition to the war at home.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you very much for allowing me to take part. I wish I could be there in person, and I'm very sorry that I can't be. But I'm honored to be in such august company. To answer your question, how is Putin responding to criticism at home? The answer is with extreme harshness, really almost Stalinist harshness in some cases. My friend Vladimir Karamazov is serving a 25-year sentence. What did he do? He said some things. He gave speeches, he wrote some articles, and for that, they've given him 25 years. I mean, it really does boggle the mind. Ilya Yashin, another magnificent Russian oppositionist, is doing 8.5 years for simply saying what everybody knew, that Russia committed war crimes in Bucha on the outskirts of Kiev. Alexei Navalny, of course, died in prison. He was in prison for his long-standing opposition to the regime, but also because he outspokenly criticized the war in Ukraine. We have one heroic woman serving a 7-year sentence for replacing 5 price tags at a supermarket with anti-war messages, the amazing Alexandra Skachilenka. And there are, now some 20,000 Russians who've been thrown into jail for demonstrating against the war. People have been arrested, thrown in jail for holding up blank signs at protests. This is how surreal it becomes. But that's just part of the equation. The other part of the equation is that Putin is not content to crack down on critical voices at home. He's also hunting down his opponents overseas. sometimes, in some cases, assassinating them or trying to intimidate them in a variety of ways. We've had a whole series of mysterious deaths of prominent Russians, business people, officials, former officials, inside Russia and out, often in very suspicious circumstances. And we don't really know what's going on there, but clearly there is a pattern there which is designed to suggest that if you step out of line, something really, really bad can happen to you, and you may not even be safe overseas. And then there's the point that Putin also sees us as a soft target. So the mirror, not quite mirror, but the very parallel image of this internal repression is his efforts to sow disinformation abroad, often with the help of the Chinese and some of his other partners overseas. And we've gotten to the point where we have people in the American Congress repeating Russian disinformation openly. You know, Margaret Taylor Greene, excuse me, you know, saying that Zelensky had bought yachts or something with American foreign aid, which was proven to be an outright lie that came from a Russian-sponsored website. You know, Tucker Carlson on one of his broadcasts repeated these Russian lies about, you know, nefarious American biolabs in Ukraine. So, you know, even when he can't eliminate his opponents, Putin can also sow distrust and cynicism in Western societies, and he's doing that very, very avidly. I think taken together, all of this shows that his intentions are very serious. He's not screwing around. You make the slightest move in a critical direction at home, and you're going to have big problems. Everybody knows it. And if you make some critical moves overseas, well, he has a whole bunch of different ways of coming at you, intimidating you, creating a negative environment. So we are experiencing someone with very, very serious plans. I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Ambassador Herbst, back to you. There are foreign policy analysts out there that say that we should leave Ukraine by the side and focus on China. What do you make of that argument?
I think I provided a partial answer to that already. China and Russia are in a quote-unquote limitless partnership. Now, point of fact, that's baloney. It's limitless only if you limit yourself to the rhetorical realm, in which case their rhetoric is limitless in their antagonism to the United States. But China is supporting Russia's war effort, there's no doubt about it, getting bargain basement hydrocarbon prices. They're buying Russian oil and gas. They are sending as much as they can to Russia in the area of dual-use technology, but carefully designed not to cross our red lines. So they don't want a major confrontation with us in their support for Russia. But the point is they are operating together, although within clear limits. And she is watching carefully the Western reaction to Putin's outright aggression, a war crimes-filled aggression. And if he sees that the West does not have the gumption to stop Putin in Ukraine, he will draw comparable conclusions about the West's willingness to stop him across the Taiwan Straits. This is the vital connection. And if we see correctly China as the more dangerous adversary in the long run because their capacity is notably greater than Russia's, we need to stop the lesser danger so we don't face the greater one. This is basic geopolitics. And you have to be extraordinarily naive to talk about the Chinese danger and not recognize that Putin is Xi's cat's paw. Recognize that, everything falls into place. And again, you want to have the least expenditure of American treasure and lives in the Southwest Pacific. Stop Putin with American weapons and American economic assistance, bolstered by our European allies, in fact, providing more assistance than we are. And we are big winners globally. And this also relates to Iran. You know, there's a slice of the populist right in the United States is all in to support Israel, which makes sense, but says there's no connection between Hamas's aggression against Israel and Iran's vital support for that, and Russia. Now, all you need are eyes to see, as opposed to blinkered eyes, to note that a major Hamas delegation was in Moscow within a few days of their massacre of Israeli civilians, and to watch Russia giving major diplomatic support to Hamas and Iran at the UN. You don't need to be a genius to see that. You just have to look squarely at the international picture and squarely speak up for American leadership and American interests. Don't just talk about being for America, actually be for America.
There's probably a similar question to you. I mean, there are also foreign policy analysts and their like out there who say that Putin only invaded Ukraine to stop them from getting into NATO, that he would never come after an actual NATO state. You're sitting on NATO's front line and you see the threat from Russia. What do you say to those arguments that it's only about preventing Ukraine from being in NATO, that there's nothing, that Putin wouldn't go further?
Well, this is another proof of Russian disinformation used inside NATO debate. Unfortunately, disinformation that was spread by Putin in Munich in 2007 and accepted by, including, this administration. Because Russians, and Ambassador Danfried can remember those debates on Baltic membership in NATO. Russians, they were always favoring, well, Baltic membership in EU, but please not in NATO, okay? If Lithuania joins NATO, it will be nuclear war. Russians will nuke America for sure. Kaliningrad will become exclaimed. Okay, it will be disaster, total disaster. But I remember what Ambassador Danfried was saying in Leonard Mary 1 year ago. If we would then listen to Russian arguments, today we would fight not for Bakhmut, but for Warsaw. In Baltics, you don't have a war. In Baltics, we are the richest and safest in our history. Lithuanians, are beaconing freedom all around. This is because EU and NATO moved together. I have this sign, of EU and American flags together. This is what Russians are afraid of: unity of action. And also look to the history. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer was suggested exactly this. Please don't join NATO, We will maybe be, actually giving you Germany back in Soviet times. And if Konrad Adenauer would then accept this offer, he would have another socialist republic of Germany then. And okay, let's go to more recent history. We listened to this Russian propaganda. Actually, German and French leaders listened to that in Bucharest. We didn't enlarge NATO. We didn't have a plan or membership action plan then. It took 4 months for Russia to invade Georgia despite, we listened to them. NATO didn't took that decision. And the same happened in Ukraine in 2014 and 22. So this also shows that Russia and China is very much afraid of Americans have a plan and do it together. Because really in Europe, it's such a narrow, it's like, I would say it's in 20 years when the doors of enlargement are opening. Now it's opening again because we saw those atrocities that reminded us the Second World War. And we came back to all the ideas of Robert Schuman, de Gasperi, and we understood, oh my God, the only way to create a family together, to join our forces against the evil. So this is time for Americans to understand that this would be the most effective for Washington now to join the efforts of Europeans, ask Europeans to clean all the mess in Ukraine. And we are very good on that. Those bureaucrats in Brussels with all experience, they are the best vaccines against Soviet viruses. They annihilate it in every corner of your body. They are really the best. But then Americans should negotiate with new leaders of Europe, with von der Leyen. I think she will be again president. So what's the joint plan? If Europeans are moving to defense commission, and we will, in next term, we will build defense. But I would love this to be done with Americans. I wouldn't love this only French type of story to be developed in Europe. I would love to do it with you. So it's wonderful opportunity to have some kind of Marshall Plan for Ukraine and do the job till 28, like in this report of Rasmussen is saying, because this will be the time we are finishing accession talks with Ukraine. And remember the history, Dan remembers it very well. We started accession talks in '99, and we were closing the talks in 2002. It was like 2 months left till Copenhagen, where we finished it in December. Then Bush moved in with NATO Prague Summit like a few months before and made this decision. But it was wonderful action of coordination. So now it's time to show the unity for all our enemies, to boost the morale of Ukrainians who are fighting for our lives, because if not, it might come the situation that NATO will have to fight. Because if we fail Ukrainians again, we will have a war. We will have a war like Poles and Lithuanians. We will not wait for the moment Ukrainians annihilated. And then America will have to step in. So I know that it took some years in America to arrive to Casablanca decision from, a lot of wrong decisions of isolations. But, we are very historic nations. We're the bloodland nations. We paid for that history with our blood and territories. We ask Americans not to make those historic mistakes and not to wait for new Pearl Harbors and not to wait for new twins to happen. This is still manageable. This is doable in the best unity with Europeans. And Russians are trying to attack your leadership, and like one of colleagues in Britain was saying, Russians will never take Ukraine, but the Russians are taking NATO capitals, and I think they're trying to take Washington, and I think they succeeded.
We're going to go to Christian in just a second here, but to our audience joining online, you've heard Mr. Pavlionis call out Ambassador Fried, who's joining us here in the audience, so we're lucky to not only have an illustrious panel, but also an illustrious audience in that way. Christian, back to you. I think we're all wondering about the Russian people and what they think of all this. What do we know about what Russians think about the Kremlin, not only Kremlin aggression, but their broader designs that I think the panel has laid out really well?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that the Russian people, the collective mind of the Russian people has been poisoned pretty effectively by Kremlin propaganda. I don't think we can sugarcoat it. It could hardly be otherwise, considering the incessant barrage of crazy propaganda to which they are subjected by the government. So I think Putin's popularity is still quite high among many Russians, even though it's probably not quite as high as his last election result would suggest. But I think when it comes to the war, attitudes are a little bit more complicated than they might appear on the surface, right? Polls show overwhelming support for the war, but when you begin to differentiate the polling questions and when you cross-check those polls with social media research and other sources of, surveys of opinion, you get a slightly more complicated picture. And what we see is that, there's a minority of people who are really gung-ho, ultra-patriotic, ultra-nationalistic, who accept a lot of the regime propaganda without question. There's a pretty small but significant minority of people, especially in the big cities among educated people, who are critical and in some cases outright anti-war. And in the middle, you have most Russians. I mean, I have to be careful about using the word middle, because I think most Russians are actually rather unpolitical and apathetic. In the early years of his regime, Putin made a great deal with Russians, basically saying, you stay out of politics, be apathetic, be cynical, but just stay out of politics. And in return, I will ensure you a certain degree of prosperity and stability. And for a long time, he was able to hold that bargain. He's not holding it now. He's actually preaching instability. He's preaching danger, risk. I think a lot of Russians are really, really wondering what's going on with this war. Yevgeny Prigozhin, not a nice guy, nonetheless generated an enormous amount of personal popularity because he was perceived as, breaking through official lies about the war. He said at one point that the war had been started under completely false pretenses. And that seemed to resonate with people. His guys were treated as heroes on the streets of Rostov, which doesn't really coexist comfortably with this picture of fanatical support for Putin. So I think it's very complicated. Putin is, in fact, I think, aware that it's complicated, which is why he pays these enormous sums of money to the families of service members who have been killed in the war. He clearly sees that he has to tamp down possible discontent that might result from this really impressive list of casualties that Russians have been suffering. I mean, it's now just a mind-boggling casualty rate. And the fact that he's spending so much money trying to mollify the relatives of these dead soldiers tells me a lot. And I think that, just to conclude, that we have probably not been doing a very good job of messaging to the Russian people, figuring out ways to counter Russian lies. If I were Ukraine, I would be sending a drone attack against Putin's palace in Gelendzhik on the Black Sea. It's not a military target, but it would be a great way of reminding not only Ukrainians, but also Russians, what kind of president they actually have. Let's not forget that Alexei Navalny's video about that monument to Putin's corruption was watched by tens and tens and tens of millions of people, including Russians, on YouTube. So, I think we could do a much better job of, building on that legacy.
Thanks, Christian. I would encourage folks, there's a recent follow-up video from some Russian opposition groups who actually made it inside Putin's palace and got some good video. It's really quite something. But Dr. Polyakova, to you, Christian laid out what the support for the war is like inside Russia, but where is Russia finding support for the war, or at least apathy in the international arena? I mean, Putin's more isolated than he was before the big invasion, but who's on the sidelines, who's supporting Russia, and how can the West help counter some of those dynamics?
Well, just to follow up on the conversation that's been ongoing, I think this is going to be a moment for when the history books are written that will, I think in hindsight, be seen as a moment when we saw the beginning of the end of U.S. global leadership, or when we see a resurgence of U.S. global leadership and a consolidation of a democratic vision for the international order that is led by the United States. Because, sure, we've had our own problems with foreign policy decisions. There's no question about that. There's many we can point to over the complicated history of the United States, especially since World War II. But if you talk to almost any European, they will tell you, we need you to be the bully. We need you to set the agenda. And then maybe begrudgingly, but we follow. And that's been the pattern that we've had. And if the U.S. isn't there, if the U.S. is not taking this leadership role within NATO, if it's not taking its leadership role within the broader international security community, we're not going to have a security community. And we're going to have increased chaos and increased regional conflicts across the world. It could really emerge anywhere at any time. So when we're talking about this question of can we do both? Can we defeat Russia and Ukraine and mitigate or confront China in the eventual scenario of a Taiwan confrontation in the Indo-Pacific? Well, imagine the reality in which we have a massive war somewhere in South America, in our own neighborhood. It's not outside the realm of possibilities. Imagine what happens if the current Israel-Hamas war becomes a broader regional conflict. I think we are suffering from a real failure of imagination about what is really at stake when we talk about Russia's war against Ukraine. So when you're talking about who's on the fence, well, all you have to do is look at the UN votes over the last few years condemning Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and we see who's on the fence. It is a lot of countries in the unfortunate term global south, which I don't like because we're talking about dozens and dozens of countries. But it is a lot of countries that could see some benefits from examples of Russia, from the example of China. They get a lot of economic benefits. Certainly, authoritarian leading regimes get stabilization support from the Wagner Group and other PMCs who are actively pushing out Western and broader U.S. presence in Africa in particular. It's a huge, huge development that's been taking time, but it's happening as we speak. So we are losing ground. And I think there's a real opportunity for us to work together with Europe because I think in many ways, U.S. diplomacy is becoming, and maybe has become, a lost cause in a lot of these countries. And I think this is also where Europe has an opportunity, and not just Europe, but the EU in particular, because Europe has its own dark history with colonialism, but the EU does not. And many people don't really understand what the EU is, but that's a huge benefit, that strategic ambiguity, for the EU to do the kinds of public diplomacy in the so-called global south to engage. And I think these are the kinds of things we need to be thinking about now. And unfortunately, I'm not sure we have this big global vision. Because if we did, we'd be doing a lot of things very differently. We'd be thinking about how we can contain Russia, what that looks like today versus what it looked like during the Soviet era. We'd be thinking about not financing Russia's war by buying its energy and gas, which Europe continues to do. And we'd be thinking about not just seizing Russian sovereign wealth and sovereign fund assets, foreign currency assets, but giving those assets to Ukraine. We have the ability to do that, but it takes leadership and it takes an ability to actually wake up to the reality that we're in. And I think, unfortunately, we're still far away from that, but it doesn't mean we won't get there.
Thank you again for everyone joining us here, both in our Atlantic Council studio here and online. I have one more question that I need to ask Ambassador John Herbst, and then I would love to get more questions from your audience. We're going to go straight into that, and we'll do kind of a lightning round to get through as many as possible. So please do send in your questions to askac.org. Ambassador Herbst, we saw back in April a relatively robust U.S. response when Iran sent a major missile attack at Israel. And we've seen less active responses to Russian missile attacks on Ukraine. Can you give us a picture of what is the importance both of Israel and Ukraine to the United States?
The United States has been the essential partner for Israel for most of its existence, and certainly since the Yom Kippur War in the early 70s. So we are used to that. We have no such history with Ukraine. But the stakes in Europe are at least as great as they are in the Middle East, and I would argue they're probably greater because Israel, given the way we have armed it, can fend off Iran if there were a confrontation. Ukraine needs the support of the United States and Europe in order to prevail over Russia. And if the world's only peer nuclear superpower to the United States wins by aggression, again, the global consequences are enormous. So one, you have the history of support for Israel, which is decades and decades old. You don't have a comparable history with Ukraine. But secondly, you have the fact that the aggressor in Europe is a nuclear superpower. Certain Western politicians, including sadly in this town, have been intimidated by Putin's nuclear threats. Whenever you're in a confrontation with a nuclear power, you have to take those threats seriously, but you cannot be intimidated by them, nor seen to be intimidated by them. And we went toe-to-toe with a more formidable adversary, the Soviet Union, over Berlin in '61, over Cuba in '62, and never once did an American senior official say, we could not do X or Y or Z in that confrontation because the other guys have nukes and may escalate. That's a very bad look for a superpower. The Romans said correctly, if you want peace, prepare for war. That includes maintaining your own deterrence. So this has been another reason why the support we gave to Israel, which I welcomed and supported, came so easily, and why our support for Ukraine has come reluctantly and late and insufficiently. Having said that, our support for Ukraine has grown in the right direction. Just the pattern of being late and too little persists. And just to make a point, which I don't think has received enough attention right now, although the next panel I'm sure will get into this, it's an absolute disgrace that United States weapons cannot be used to strike at Russian military targets in Russia, especially as the Aleppoization of Kharkiv is undertaken by artillery on highways that are 2 or 3 miles from the Russian-Ukrainian border on the Russian side, and by Russian aircraft also 10 or so miles from the Russian-Ukrainian border, sending glide bombs into Kharkiv. We give Ukraine the ability to use our weapons. The Russian attack on Kharkiv immediately becomes much less deadly, and the modest gains Moscow has made in the northeast of Ukraine disappear. It's time to put that ridiculous policy to bed.
Thank you. We have 10 minutes left, and we're going to do audience Q&A. I'm going to kindly encourage our panelists to stick to 90-second responses here, and we'll try to get as many questions in as we can. Mr. Pavlionis, first one is to you. This is an anonymous question. Is it time for NATO to up its presence in the Baltics? Should we be concerned about a Russian invasion there, or is Putin too distracted in Ukraine?
Well, if Washington NATO Summit does nothing to Ukraine and doesn't invite, yes, we are bracing everything we have in the Baltics, and we are preparing to meet the Russians in Lithuanian streets, because it will be kind of end of NATO, like even the regional power, because today regional leader Russia is acting like global leader, and global leader America is not even able to act like a regional leader, because you are not, defending what's most important in NATO. So it could be the last glorious summit to celebrate the past of NATO, because Ukraine without NATO has no future. NATO without Ukraine has no future.
Thank you. Dr. Polyakova, next one's to you. Do you think that a strong political statement by NATO at the Washington Summit could have a practical impact on Russia's decisions in the Kharkiv front?
Well, it depends what we mean by strong political statement. I think certainly if we show strength, if we say we understand that this is a nuclear power we're confronting, but we can manage that escalation like we managed for decades with the Soviet Union. I think the only language the Russians understand, the Kremlin understands, is strength. And what we have shown with our policy, which has done a lot of good, but it's also been very incremental, is that we are willing to back down and that we aren't deterred by nuclear deterrence. The Russians have demonstrated the effectiveness of nuclear deterrence by deterring us. And so, yes, if we had a strong political statement saying that Ukraine's place is in NATO, that we dropped this idea of the summit being a bridge, but we opened accession negotiations. The Ukrainians understand why an invitation right now is not on the cards. But why don't we do what the EU has done? The EU has opened the way for Ukraine to have accession negotiations with the EU. Every other country in the so-called former Soviet bloc, the Eastern Bloc, joined NATO first, and then the EU. Why are we reversing that for Ukraine?
You've teed up this next question perfectly, and this is to Ambassador Herbst. Again, another anonymous one. NATO already ditched the membership action plan requirement for Ukraine at the Vilnius Summit, says this question. What does a tangible step toward Ukraine's NATO membership look like at Washington?
A group of us came up with a proposal last fall, and Alina kind of just referred to it, to invite Ukraine to NATO membership accession talks. Actually, I give Sandy Vershbow the credit for that specific proposal. And we now see that former Secretary General Rasmussen has endorsed that in a proposal that he put out with Andriy Yermak, and we'll talk about this later with the two of them at this event. So this could be a good step forward, which is short of actual invitation to join. But equally important is using the NATO summit to take specific steps to strengthen Ukraine's defense capabilities. Ideally, a nice weapons package to be announced there. I'm not promising that result, but sound-minded thinkers are pushing hard for such a result.
Mr. Carroll, I have one that I wonder if you can take. This is from Laurel Atkinson. who asks, Russia repeatedly says it's willing to negotiate, but Ukraine has stuck to a 10-point peace plan, which Russia has not accepted. What areas are open for discussion at this upcoming peace summit in Switzerland? And what can be done if the Russians aren't willing to participate or talk about real peace?
Well, I think the priority should be to win the war. I mean, everything else is kind of extra. I think that we need to revive our support for the Ukrainians. We need to get the weapons flowing again. We need to help them win the war. We need to help them get into a much better position. You know, by stalling on providing them with aid, we put them in a terrible, terrible negotiating position if it ever comes to negotiations. The key thing is that it's up to the Ukrainians whether they want to negotiate. I don't think we can talk about Ukraine without Ukraine. And everything else is details, right? And also, we don't have a lot of time left in the discussion, so I think I'll leave it at that.
Perfect, thank you.
Can I make one comment
Please
on
do.
this negotiations discussion? I think when we say the word negotiations in the West, we mean something completely different than what the Russians understand by that. Because to them, negotiations is just a way to understand what might be on the table, but there's no real sincere goal in the end. And so all of these longstanding conversations about, well, if the Russians are willing to negotiate, well, when we say that, we think they're going to come to the table and compromise, because that's what negotiations are. But they think we're going to come to the table and find out what else we can get, and then we're just going to leave. And the Ukrainians did actually try, which is shocking to me that they sat across the table from the aggressor at the beginning of the full-scale invasion to negotiate with the Russians. And where did that go? And that's because that's exactly what the Russians want, negotiations for the sake of negotiations. And we cannot fall into that trap because they have no incentive to be a sincere negotiating partner right now because they're not in a position of weakness yet.
And I just want to add, that's very quickly, I just want to add that in Putin's inauguration speech recently, he said there will be no negotiations with Ukraine in a position of strength. He made it very clear that he's only willing to negotiate with them if they're weak. But I subscribe to everything that Alina just said, right?
I think the best peace negotiations with the Russians would be accession negotiations of Ukraine to NATO.
Yes.
Well put.
Agreed.
We love our questions here at askac.org, but I see we also have 2 questions here in person. I think we're equipped to take them. Please.
Ambassador, this one's for you for the policy that you mentioned. Alina, I'm a corporate board director. Question for you. So the policy about restricting the ability for Ukraine to attack targets inside Russia, do you see that policy changing after the election? And what would it take for that policy to change?
For me?
Yes.
I am confident that that policy will change. I just don't know when. And I'm not sure that the election is the only factor that would play on this. A point of fact, watching, again, the Aleppoization of Kharkiv could persuade the administration to change its policy very soon. The prospect of ongoing Russian gains in the Northeast while we are convening the 75th anniversary of NATO, it's a terrible optic. And I imagine someone in the White House has figured that out. So that could also be a reason to change. But what precisely will trigger the change, I'm not certain.
Thank you. We have one more in-person question here.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to listen your high-value insight. My name is Arda Shehan, a transatlantic affairs student in Fletcher School and College of Europe. I think a dedicated U.S. contribution to Euro-Atlantic security is essential, but also European contribution to a collective defense, deterrence, and security efforts is also a crucially important matter. My question is Europe ready to mobilize its military industry, change conscription law, or increase defense spending and create a European collective military procurement procedure? And will supranational leadership suffice to address these issues following the EU elections next month? Thank you very much.
I think it's to you.
Well, I think we will soon come back more often to Washington to lecture you on defense spending, because we are now speaking about 3 and 4% spending, at least in those territories who are bordering Russia, and I'm not so sure about American spending anymore. So weakness invites wars, and we have to do it together. The miracles that, for example, Germans are doing in Lithuania, building military base, brigade is coming. We are signing Rheinmetall ammunition. So those are the miracles. But again, if Americans are absent strategically, if NATO is not enlarging, it will be just a European show. And I dislike it. I like the family coming and doing it together.
Thank you very much. We're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you for joining us for our first panel today, the strategic danger to the U.S., NATO, and the West, Russian aggression and revisionism. Thank you to our panelists, Zygoumentis Pavlionis, Dr. Alina Polyakova, Ambassador John Herbst, and Christian Carroll, who joined us online. Please stick around for a very special fireside discussion in just a minute. Thank you.
If I could ask people to, yeah, please. We have critical guests online. So if you want to have a conversation, please step outside, but you'll miss the introduction of our speakers.
Folks, please take your seats. We have another event right now.
Thank you. All right. We have now a virtual fireside chat, and you can see our very eminent speakers on the screen. We have former Prime Minister of Denmark, former Secretary General of NATO, Mr. Anders Fogh Rasmussen on the screen. And we have the Chief of the President's Office in Ukraine, Andriy Yermak, on the screen. Secretary General, Prime Minister Rasmussen will talk about the proposal for Ukraine's security that they recently introduced. And then Mr. Yermak will discuss this subject further. So, Prime Minister Rasmussen, over to you. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ambassador Herbst, for this introduction and the invitation to speak at this important event. It comes at a vital time, just 7 weeks ahead of the 75th anniversary NATO Summit in Washington, D.C. And last week in Copenhagen, Andriy Yermak and I launched a report on Ukraine's security and Euro-Atlantic integration. It focuses on what Ukraine's allies must do to contain the war and lay the foundations for a lasting peace. The recommendations were signed by leading political figures from NATO countries, including former presidents, prime ministers, and secretaries of state. The report comes at a difficult moment. Russia has made progress on the battlefield while continuing brutal attacks on Ukrainian cities. And this is the result of our hesitancy. Over the last 2 years, Ukraine's allies have delayed at almost every moment. Leaders spent a year debating whether to send heavy battle tanks, long-range missiles, fighter jets. And while we hesitated, Vladimir Putin escalated. Still, this hesitancy continues. The latest package of US military aid took more than 6 months to approve. Europe struggles to deliver anywhere near the level of weapons pledged. Governments still refuse to deliver critical weapon systems, while constraining how Ukraine can use those that have already been delivered. And the damage done by this hesitancy can be counted in Ukrainian lives. We must wake up. we must change our approach of giving too little, too late, of reacting to Russia's atrocities rather than acting to prevent them. Political leaders need to show clearly that our support for Ukraine's security and sovereignty is irreversible. Right now, Vladimir Putin still doubts that. He still believes he can outlast the democratic world. And until he loses that belief, Russia will continue to fight. Ukraine's allies must be bold to change the calculus in Moscow. And the report launched last week sets out how to do that. I will focus on 3 recommendations. First, NATO leaders should issue an invitation for Ukraine to begin accession talks at the Washington Summit in July. Second, they should set a target date for Ukraine's NATO membership of no later than July 2028. And third, they should adopt measures to contain the war and bring it to a favorable conclusion for Ukraine. Let me elaborate a bit on it. First, on the invitation at the Washington Summit. The report calls for allies to launch accession talks with Ukraine while tasking the Ukraine NATO Council to look at the specific conditions that need to be addressed. Opening accession talks does not mean that Ukraine will join NATO overnight, but it sends an unequivocal message to Putin that Ukraine's NATO membership is inevitable, that continuing his legal war will not prevent it. Second, the report sets a target date for Ukrainian membership of no later than July 2028. For 20 years, Ukraine has been left in NATO's waiting room. That has proved extremely dangerous. By setting an ambitious but realistic date for membership, NATO leaders make clear that Ukraine is not being moved from one waiting room to another, and that they are committed to progressing quickly on the outstanding questions regarding Ukraine's membership. And then third, the report sets out a series of measures that can help contain and end the war. These focus both on steps to boost financial support for Ukraine and those to constrain Russia's ability to escalate. Let me highlight 2 of the proposals. First, the report calls for allies to lift all caveats on the supply of weapons to Ukraine, as well as all caveats on their use. 2 years after Russia's full-scale invasion, and allies are still asking Ukraine to fight with one arm tied behind its back. Russia is launching devastating strikes from within occupied territories and Russia itself. Ukraine must be able to hit these launchers. And then second, the report calls for the creation of a humanitarian air defense shield over Western Ukraine. This would, of course, involve NATO allies providing a vast package of air defense for Ukraine, but also using systems within neighboring NATO countries to target incoming Russian missiles and drones. This should take inspiration from the air defense Israel's allies provided in response to Iran's attacks earlier this year. Doing this is both legally and militarily possible. It just requires political will. So finally, let me conclude. The report sets out an ambitious agenda. It is one backed by leading figures who recognize that we must be bold, that we must set out a clear plan for a sovereign and independent Ukraine and lasting peace and security in Europe. And that starts with an invitation for Ukraine to start accession talks in Washington, D.C. Thank you, and I look very much forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. A terrific report. And Mr. Yermak, over to you.
Ambassador Herbst, thanks for introductions. Hello to everyone, and thanks for having me here. Thanks for keeping focus on the things that really matter. And a special thanks to my friend Anders for great speech. In fact, he has our common positions, so I'll rather have some remarks and additions. I guess everyone agreed that transatlantic security is a kind of puzzle. It can never be perfect, then some piece is missing. Today, the piece is Ukraine. Ukraine is a key element. Without it in its place, all of us have to deal with transatlantic insecurity. It has been that way since 2004. But now we are approaching the point of no return, the point where the puzzle can either break apart or get complete, robust, and strong. We are approaching this point this year. Then NATO celebrated its 75th anniversary. There's a tragic irony in it. For its strongest defensive allies in the history may become useless and unable to secure some of its own members. It's really simple. If Ukraine stands, Europe stands. If Ukraine falls, the Kremlin will choose its next victim. Be it in a hybrid war or in an invasion, or both, what doesn't really matter. Empires never stop by themselves. We thank all the nations who have been helping us fight the invaders. We are grateful for every ballot and every medical aid package. But let me tell you something. Anders has mentioned hesitations, and I think we should go further. We should talk about priorities. It is a strategy for the winning, or it is a strategy to prolong agony. Ukraine may be defeated, but it can't be conquered. What means the war may last for decades. Just to give you an idea of what it is, the last fight between Soviet and Ukrainian Encirclement Army, UPA, took place on April 14th, 1960, 15 years after World War II ended. But what was agony? In the last 2 years, our soldiers had to buy time for the Western decisions makers far too often. Russia has recently launched a new offensive, so now is in the latest time. I wish it were the last one. We are stubbornly resisting, but this offensive means one thing: Russia is not going to stop. We have to stop it together. And I really like to pay attention to one crucial thing. It is true that economically NATO overcame Russia, but there is no point in the mechanically comparing them. On one hand, your combined GDP is 25 times bigger. But on another hand, Russia's military production is 5 to 10 times cheaper. Besides, Russia can spend 60% of GDP on war. If NATO did the same, you'd have built a fleet of Death Stars. Helping Ukraine cost the West less than 0.2% of its combined GDP. It's $70 to $8 billion per year. Considering the price disparately, it's translated to just $20 billion in Russian military spending. While its war budget, it's $120 billion. So having 25 times smaller GDP, Russia spent 6 times more to wage the war. Sure, the alliance states' commitment to donate 0.25% of their GDP to Ukraine will not turn the tide on its own. Integrating Ukraine into the collective security architecture will. Besides, it will be more cost-effective for the alliance. But first of all, Ukraine must be invited. Many thanks, it's impossible as long as the war continues. We are wrong. With proper determination, anything is possible. We have proven this many times. I admit that Putin could resort to nuclear blackmail again. But you need to understand one thing about Russian authorities. People who build palaces, enjoy luxury life, and hide money abroad, people whose children don't live in Russia, they love life too much to stand the apocalypse. Besides, the invitation isn't the same as a membership. In the meantime, it will signal that Russia has lost its reason for war. Justification for aggression was precisely Ukraine's inspiration to join the alliance. They invited not because we want to, they invited because since 2008, NATO has been failing to let us in. Inviting Ukraine right now would be a vital step to the strengthening the security of the Europe and the entire Europe-Atlantic community. It would show Russia can't dictate its will to the alliance. The aggressor must not set their own red lines. However, it would be red line for Russia itself. Moreover, Ukrainians' clear membership perspective would be a powerful signal of stopping the aggressor. It would be demonstrated that the international community's resolve to protect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the states. Putin must understand the path to de-escalation and restoring stability in Europe lies only through the complete cessation of aggression. NATO needs to show it is a functional guarantor of the European security. After all, Russia can complete its united strength. In the same time, by the opening doors for Ukraine, NATO will enhance the security of the valuable ally. The Ukrainian army today, it's famous fact, it's one of the most combat-ready and motivated in the Europe, and maybe one of the most strong army in the world. Over the 10 years of fighting Russian aggressions, it has gained great combat experience. Ukrainian society has become a reliable outpost of NATO democratic values. So the invitation would be an acknowledgement of Ukrainian bravery and the struggle for the freedom. But at the same time, it will be help the alliance to strengthening its collective defense capabilities. We need to make a grand step of defense of our common future, free, peaceful, and prosperous for all peoples in Europe and in the world. But above all, Ukraine's invitation to NATO will not escalate the conflict. It will help to end the war. Thank you for your attention. And now the pleasure will be ready to answer to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Yermak. That was super. All right, I have a couple of questions, and we may have time for one or two audience questions as well. Mr. Yermak, again, congratulations on this report, same Mr. Rasmussen. But have you discussed this report with the U.S. and other NATO partners? What has been the reaction, if you have? And what do you expect at the July summit in Washington, Mr. Yermak?
Yes, of course, we in the constant dialogue with our partners, and this report is not execution. And plus, you can see the very respect and famous people, politics, and my friend Sanders said it's former presidents, former prime minister, generals, including the representative of United States, of course. And I think it's necessary to say that all the members of our task force group, will be anonymously approved these documents. For us, with others, it was very much important. As talking for expectations, I think that everything in the list of this report, but of course, being war during 2 years, to show that Ukrainian nations not just able to defend, Ukrainian nations able to win this war. And all our friends and partners already made historical contributions for freedom, for democracy. Now it's necessary to give everything which we need to win this war. And of course, about Washington Summit, we waiting strong decisions. It's time, after 2 years, again, I think we show that we're able. We really show that our people, it's extremely strong and brave. And of course, it's time for strong decisions of the leaders, which really show that democracy will win and dictators will lose. I think it's so simple. It's just necessary to continue this great job which we do together all these 2 years. We hear our heroes in the front line, our people now in Kharkiv, which non-stop under the attack of missiles, rockets, and Iranian drones. Our people in Kherson, in Sumy, in Kiev, in many other cities. Our expectations that our friends, our partners, will make a real, strong, historical decisions, especially in the summit, which is anniversary, 75 years. The world need to receive very strong, very clear signal that any aggressors, any dictators, know the chance in our world. Thank you.
Thank you. A strong answer, comprehensive. Mr. Prime Minister, you had great experience as Secretary General. Your report makes the bold recommendation on reducing all restrictions on advanced weapons to Ukraine and their use. Do you see Western policy, especially American and German policy on these issues, changing soon? And how can we hasten this change?
Now, First of all, I think we received the very good news that in all secrecy, the US has delivered the long-range ATACMS missile some months ago. So we have seen a move already, and I think that should be followed by an American pressure on the government in Berlin so that Germany delivers the long-range and very useful Taurus missiles. I don't understand why Chancellor Scholz is opposed to taking that decision. I don't see any single argument against giving Ukraine everything they need to win the war against Russia. That's actually the best way to pave the path to peace. So I think first and foremost, the Americans should put pressure directly on the government in Germany. Secondly, we have prepared this report, the Copenhagen formula, so to speak, by numerous former political leaders who have spoken up in bold language to encourage current political leaders to really take bold decisions. I also think tanks like Atlantic Council can play a useful role in pushing for more bold decisions at the NATO Summit in Washington. I think in America it's important to understand that the way to focus stronger on the real long-term geopolitical challenge, namely China, the way to do that is to ensure a clear Russian defeat in Ukraine. Xi Jinping is closely following what is going on in Ukraine, and he will conclude, if Putin can take Crimea, then Xi Jinping, can take Taiwan. There's a clear link. So I think those forces in the US that rightly are very much focused on China need to understand that the road to challenging stronger against China is to ensure a Russian defeat in Ukraine. And finally, whoever wins the election in November in the US, I don't think an American president would like to be portrayed as a loser. And if Putin wins in Ukraine, then the American president, whoever it will be portrayed as a loser. And that would be catastrophic not only for the US, but for the whole democratic world. So I think these arguments need to be presented very strongly.
Terrific, terrific answer. All right, we've got audience questions and we have 8 minutes left. So, Mr. Yermak, what can Ukraine's European allies do to best support Ukraine, both in the lead up to the NATO summit and during the NATO summit?
Thank you very much, and thank you again, Anders. Said what we really need today for continue our fightings and to be the success in battlefield. First of all, we need now, it's point number one, it's air defense. This is extremely important, and honestly, I don't believe that if all our partners, all our friends together make decisions and do the best, it's not impossible to found so important numbers of the patriots, which really closed and survived the lives of the Ukrainians in such city like Kharkov, like Sumy and others. The second, of course, it's necessary before the July summit, we have two very important things. We're waiting that in June will be exactly started negotiations for our European membership. And of course, it's a very important, and will be very big motivation for our soldiers, for our society. And of course, we're now in the final stage for the preparation of the first inaugurated peace summit in Switzerland, which will take place in 15th, 16th of June. I think it's one more opportunity to show that the responsible country, the international society, able to really settle so difficult problem like the war, like the crisis. And of course, we know that our European colleagues have the great opportunity not just to be present in the level of the leaders of this country, but also involved the country from other continents, from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, from Middle East, which is extremely important, not just for us, because of course, for us, it's the real concrete steps for the just peace and ending of the war. But also, it's important that the ordinary people in any place in the world really trust that international law, the chapter of United Nations, it's not just the phrase, it's real working mechanism which can protect ordinary people. And why the formula of President Zelensky unique? Because he proposed that all responsible countries sitting together and decided and show that the law, the international law, the status of United Nations, it's really work. And we are looking that in this summit, the leaders can agree very important things about food crisis, about nuclear and energy safety, and of course, very important points of the humanitarian. The people, Ukrainian prisoners of war, need to back to home. Our illegally deported children have to back to home to their parents, because thousands Ukrainians mother not living. This is a very important. And I hope that our friends and partners from Europe, from other continents, will be with us and can help us to make this very important step.
Thank you. We've got 3 minutes left. Mr. Rasmussen, we have a question. Should we be concerned about Russian hybrid aggression in the Baltic states and elsewhere? And would Russia really attack a NATO state?
Well, so far, Russia has not launched a major cyber attack. And I think it's because Russia realizes that if they do so, they might be met by an offensive cyber capability from certain NATO member states. And it just shows that the best deterrence is to be stronger than your enemy. The best way to deter a tyrant is to tell him, we don't care about your threats. The more you threaten, the more we support Ukraine. If you go into threats, you let the tyrants rule the world. And that's whether you're speaking about cyber attacks or more physical military attacks, the conclusion is exactly the same. And if I may, in a concluding remark, say, in a way, I'm optimistic because actually the US and Europe together spends 14 times as much on defense compared to Russia. 14. And when it comes to our total GDP, our total wealth, the US and Europe has an economy 20 times as big as Russia. If we mobilize all those resources, obviously, we are also able to win this war.
Thank you very much for that. Gentlemen, thank you both for this terrific presentation. And everyone in the audience, thank you very much for being with us today. And we will have a 10-minute break. Thank you. This is John Herbst again, the director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. I hope you enjoyed the first half of our event. We're coming now to the second half. And we start with a pre-record from former Prime Minister, former Foreign Minister in the UK, Liz Truss, who has done superb outreach to the Republican Party, the populist part of that party, to ensure that there is strong support for American interests, strong support for defeating Putin in Ukraine. With that, we'll turn to Madam Truss. Thank you.
The likes of which we haven't seen for decades. We saw Putin's appalling invasion of Ukraine back in 2022, and we've seen the aggression that has taken place ever since. But it's not just Russia that we face. There is an axis of authoritarian regimes, including Iran and, of course, China, who don't just seek to gain new territory. They seek to undermine freedom and democracy itself. They seek to undermine our way of life in the West. And that is why it is so important that Western nations of the free world stand up against this rise of authoritarianism. We have been supporting Ukraine, and I'm proud of what the United Kingdom has done. I'm pleased that our allies across the world have stepped up. But we cannot let up, because if Ukraine were to lose, and if Russia were to succeed, that would send an appalling signal. First of all, to Russia itself. And we know that they don't just want to see Ukraine overcome, that they're also threatening Eastern Europe, places like the Baltic states. Europeans would never feel safe again. But it also send an appalling message to aggressors around the world. So, for example, we've seen the appalling events on October the 7th in Israel as a result of terrorism in the Middle East, funded, aided and abetted by the Iranian regime. And not enough has been done to put pressure on the Iranian regime to stop the Iranian regime being able to get nuclear weapons. We've also seen China step up their threats towards Taiwan and work to circumvent the sanctions on Iran and Russia and back up those other authoritarian regimes. And I very much fear that what we would see if Russia was successful, is we would see a very strong message sent to President Xi that he would be able to take Taiwan with impunity. And that is something we cannot allow to happen. And this is a discussion I have regularly with people in the United States. If that message were sent, that Russia had won, what would that mean for America's leadership of the free world? And I haven't met a single person who wants Russia to be successful. But we have to back up those thoughts with action. What does that mean? Well, first of all, it means continuing to support Ukraine. It means not negotiating with Russia. It means ensuring Ukraine is able to push Russia out of Ukraine and Russia is ultimately defeated. It means stepping up our efforts to stop Iran gaining a nuclear weapon. And it also means taking a common economic approach, what I call an economic NATO of the free world against our adversaries. So we're not supplying them technology which they can use against their own citizens or to perpetrate a wider war. We're not enabling those regimes to carry on funding their war of despotism. That is vitally important. The final thing that we need to do is we need to rearm. The fact is the West hasn't spent enough on defence, in particular European countries haven't spent enough on defence. In the United Kingdom, we're now upping our defence spending to 2.5%. But I'd like to see us all go further. I'd like to see NATO members spend 3% of their GDP on defence, at least, because that is what it is going to take for us to be able to have the firepower, for us to be able to have the defence that we need to secure our futures. And Ukraine has to be part of that. Ukraine has demonstrated their determination to fight for freedom and democracy, and they're fighting on behalf of all of us. They are on the front line of freedom. So what I want to see is Ukraine become a NATO member as soon as possible, so that we are able to collectively defend ourselves against future threats from authoritarian regimes. Thank you for your support.
All right. Hello to everyone joining us online, and good afternoon to everyone who is joining us here in the Atlantic Council headquarters in Washington, D.C. My name is Leah Schuneman, and I'm a non-resident fellow at the Transatlantic Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council, the program that leads the NATO programming here at the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council is hosting today's conference at a critical juncture for Ukraine, as well as European and U.S. and transatlantic security. For one, this July, NATO will host the annual meeting of the North Atlantic Alliance's leadership here in Washington, D.C. This Washington summit will also mark NATO's 75th anniversary. Meanwhile, Putin's war in Ukraine has intensified, and the Russian military is making worrying advances against Ukraine's hard-fought gains. Putin and his regime seek not only the subjugation of Ukraine, but Russia's illegal military aggression is also part of the Kremlin's revisionist agenda. Last summer at the Vilnius summit, NATO delivered a vague promise to invite Ukraine to join NATO when allies agree and conditions are met. This year has been marked by enduring and increased violence by Russia, not only in Ukraine, but also directed moves by the Kremlin to destabilize international finance and food systems and engage in malign influence campaigns that challenge the democratic world order. Russia's aggression is a grave threat. Ukrainians stand bravely at the front lines, fighting for our freedom. Long-term U.S. and allied security require a secure and stable Ukraine. Without Ukraine's victory, NATO may not survive. What options then exist for the leaders who are coming into the NATO summit this July here in Washington? Where are discussions currently, and how can actions be taken at the Washington summit that will impact Ukraine's security and stability, as well as the future security of Europe and the transatlantic alliance? Today we'll be discussing some of these options and current realities. And first, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have a large panel today of distinguished experts and former officials. I'm going to go in alphabetical order, starting with Ms. Deborah Kagan, a senior advisor at the Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council. Ms. Kagan is a retired career senior U.S. Department of State and Defense Department official working from the Reagan to the Trump administrations. Kagan served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Coalition, Peacekeeping, and Humanitarian and Disaster Relief, as well as a Senior Director for European, Russian, and Eurasian Security Issues, a Special Advisor to various senior U.S. and NATO military officials, including the Chairman and the Vice Chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as other positions. Next, Ambassador Dan Fried, who's the Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow here at the Atlantic Council. In the course of his 40-year Foreign Service career, Ambassador Fried played a key role in designing and implementing American policy in Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. As a special assistant and National Security Council Senior Director for Presidents Clinton and Bush, Ambassador to Poland, and Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, Ambassador Fried helped to craft the policy of NATO enlargement to Central Europe and to combat Russian influence in the region. Ms. Alina Frolova, who is joining us virtually today, is the Deputy Chairperson at the Center for Defense Strategies, a security think tank in Ukraine, where she is joining us from today. Prior to this position, she served as the Deputy Minister of Defense in Ukraine from 2019 to 2020, and as an advisor to the Ministry of Defense. Next, Ambassador William Taylor, Bill, Vice President of the Russia and Europe program at the U.S. Institute of Peace here in Washington. Prior to this position, he was Vice President of Strategic Stability and Security at the U.S. Institute of Peace. I am curious if that means that there is no prospect for strategic stability and security, and that's. He's also a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and has a wealth of diplomatic experience that I'm sure will be valuable for the conversation today. And then last but certainly not least, Ambassador Alexander Vershbow, Sandy, is a distinguished fellow here at the Eurasia Center as well as the Transatlantic Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Ambassador Vershbow was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO from February 2012 to October 2016. Sandy also served for 3 years as the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs in the Pentagon. He's also served as U.S. Ambassador to NATO, to the Russian Federation, and to the Republic of Korea. So during his career, he has been centrally involved in strengthening U.S. defense relations with allies and in Europe and in Asia, worldwide. So a few housekeeping notes. We will have time for moderated Q&A from the audience, both virtual and here in the studios. For the virtual audience, please submit your questions to askac.org, askac.org. And the in-person audience will be able to ask questions towards the end of the panel using the mic stand over here on the left side of the room. So I would like to start with a question to Ambassador Vershbow, if I may. So you, along with many of your co-panelists today, published a memo to the president last year detailing how we can best advance U.S. vital interests through helping Ukraine win and strengthening shaping its path towards NATO membership at the Washington Summit in July. Is the suggested path for Ukraine's NATO ascension from the memo still in play? And if so, could you describe that path?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Leah. It's good to be with so many former colleagues. Short answer is yes, the basic recommendations in that memorandum to the president are very much still in play, and we think could help ensure a much more successful Washington summit than I think is now foreordained. The memo had two basic overarching recommendations. Number one was we have to win the war, which means ramping up military support, and while that has improved, particularly after we dodged a bullet with regard to the supplemental, there's still, I think, too much lethargy, too much incrementalism in the U.S. and allied provision of advanced weapons. While some bright spots have appeared, such as the transfer of ATACMS, more still needs to be done, particularly given that the 6 months without any weapon supplies were very costly for the Ukrainians, and just recovering lost ground is a big challenge. Now, the other recommendation has been discussed in the conference earlier today, relates to how to set Ukraine on a clear path to NATO membership, that should be also one of the two top priorities for the Washington Summit. And the memo recommends an approach that tried to square the circle on a couple of issues, given both the hesitation to go all the way to an invitation to membership on the part of the U.S. political leadership, but also to kind of recognize that with a war still going on, membership literally overnight is not going to be possible, and there needs to be a process that advances Ukraine's ability to actually go through that open door. I think our memo provided a template for how that could be done using accession talks, which in NATO usually come after you've been invited to membership, but we decided to flip the sequence and suggested accession talks could be a step toward the final glorious day when Ukraine gets the invitation. So this, we think, is still a workable approach. We just today heard from the co-chairman of a task force headed by my former boss, Secretary General Rasmussen, and the President Zelensky Chief of Staff, Yermak, a more fleshed out version of our proposal, if I can be so bold, which also talked about accession talks, but introduced some additional ways of shoring up Ukrainian security in the transition phase, recognizing that it will take a few years at a minimum to actually complete the accession process. The Rasmussen report adds something we didn't do, which would be a firm time horizon, no later than July 2028, 4 years from the Washington Summit, as when that membership should finally come to fruition. I think that would be a welcome addition to our approach, because having a date, even if it's a little bit out there on the horizon would send a clear message to Putin that he can't just wait us out indefinitely and keep the war going and going and going. So we think that there's still some validity in the approach that we've suggested. The administration still seems to be looking for something sort of a little less bold. They talk about a bridge to NATO, but it's not clear if this is just a metaphor or whether it actually would physically advance the Ukrainians' candidacy. I think if it means helping the Ukrainians complete their preparations for membership, meeting those conditions that were mentioned somewhat ambiguously in Vilnius, that would, I think, be a good compromise approach. And so, the debate is still very much on, and I think that without a bold decision on NATO membership, the administration risks being described as having failed to deliver, and that would be a shame for European security and a shame for Ukraine.
Especially as this is now the second NATO summit during the course of the full-scale reinvasion by Putin into Ukraine. And speaking of the operations on the ground in Ukraine, I would like to turn to Ms. Frolova. We've been hearing disturbing reports about Russia's gains in Kharkiv, particularly that Russia is trying to turn Ukraine more broadly into a second Aleppo through a massive bombing campaign. Ambassador Vershbow has just spoken about the importance of laying out steps that will ensure Ukraine's victory. What does the path to victory look like right now from your perspective in Ukraine?
Well, actually, Ukrainian perspective didn't change so much with these or other Russian moves, because we do understand that we are in existential war, and for us, the only way out of this war is to win this war. And whatever happens in Kharkiv region or in some other regions, we should understand that we have a huge front line, including borderline with Russia and Belarus. And all this borderline is potentially, not potentially, but actually the front line with different spots on it, with different like hot spots on it, and there could be a Kharkiv region, there could be a Sumy region or something else. It doesn't change the philosophy and the scope of this war. We need to win this war. For Ukrainians, of course, we have this additional like some kind of wish and condition. We want to win it with minimal losses, because we all suffering physically, economically. We all already lost our relatives, friends in this situation, lost part of our life, and we want to minimize these losses. Therefore, we are not, of course, this like doesn't make us happy, everything what's going on around Kharkiv. At the same time, Ukrainian forces, even without substantial supplies, without substantial mobilization, which unfortunately didn't come in time, they still keeping the line, and they still counterattacking on some spots of this, like of these attempts of Russia, and everyone discussing that yes, we do have this as some kind of attempt to increase Ukrainian efforts in one spot and decrease Ukrainian efforts in other spots. But this is tactical moves. And I don't think that we need to spend so much like attention on tactical moves like how it's happening now, because we need to have a strategy of winning, how we will win this war, and what would be a guarantees after this war that at least the next aggression will happen not in like in 5 years or in 10 years. So we will have a time to restore the power, restore the capacity, and be ready for the next round. And part of this answer is NATO, of course, and part of this, like a substantial part of this answer is like that United States and our other principal partners should finally say about the victory, not as long as it takes, not about support, not about breach, especially now in Ukraine, the word breach has very bad like flavor, let's say, so if we refer to the Kerch breach. So I think that part of it is that United States should have the vision of the victory, should name the victory as a victory, and should work for the victory. And I think that, okay, we can speak about some like a way to NATO. We can speak about some preconditions, which are logically, but we need to make a decision. And the United States, first of all, need to make a decision about whether they see Ukraine as a part of NATO and verbalize it actually. And from my point of view, it would be like quite a strange not to see Ukraine as a part of NATO, and especially that Putin didn't and Putin and Russia, we are not speaking just about Putin, they won't stop only occupying Ukraine, which they wish. But the news of the latest hours that Russia decided unilaterally to move the borders in Baltic Sea, which are taking part of the maritime territories of Lithuania and Finland. And they already put this as the draft of law for public announcement. So this is some kind of wake-up calls, which many will already has. And this is some steps which will be continued. They will continue to provoke NATO and to see where these so-called red lines are. And I think that the best way, which all the experts who know Russia says, the best way to stop Russia, it's to demonstrate the force. And this summit is very important, not only for Ukraine, but for the future of the security in Europe. Because if the declarations would be too soft, if we won't hear the bold statements about Ukraine, about future cooperation, and about future accession to NATO, I'm afraid it will encourage Russia to move faster and more.
Thank you so much. So you explained a lot about Russia's aggressive behavior right now, and you did point to the Baltic states. I'd like to turn to Ambassador Fried next, given your experience in the Balts and Poland and Central and Eastern Europe more widely. How are Ukraine's neighbors in Central and Eastern Europe viewing the importance of Ukraine's NATO membership and closer engagement with the alliance, especially as we head towards the Washington Summit?
Well, you heard Ambassador Pavilionis. For the Poles and the Baltic countries, Ukraine's fate is not one for academic debate. Realists versus Wilsonians. They regard Ukraine's survival as critical to themselves, and for them, Russia is not an abstraction. With every family has either living memory or close family memory of what Russia means when it comes visiting. Mass deportations, mass murder. So they are all for Ukraine's entry into NATO and its survival. They have an immediacy which is matched to some degree by some of the Taiwanese, South Koreans, and Japanese who also understand that this is not a Washington talk show game. It's real. Now, it's interesting to me that the French and Germans, the French Macron a little more clearly, and the Germans in kind of a crab-like, fashion, are moving toward the Polish position. For years, for decades, the West Europeans lectured the Poles and the Balts not to be paranoid about Russia or prisoners of history or emotional, which was sort of shockingly arrogant and ahistoric, and more to the point, it was also wrong. They misread the reality of where Putin was coming from. And to their credit, they have realized their mistake. Macron especially, he owned up in a way we should respect, where he said, yeah, we got it wrong. And you can really ask no better in terms of, you can ask no more in terms of rhetoric. You can ask a little more in terms of French military buildup, but that's another thing. The Germans, in their own fashion, and albeit inconsistently, have moved in that direction as well. I mean, look at Foreign Minister Baerbock, or Pistorius, or Habeck. I mean, look at the Green Party. This is there is a new appreciation in Western Europe that Russia is a real problem and not something American neocons have conjured up. And this is important. But much depends on the battlefield. In Ukraine, it does little good for the Europeans to have changed their strategic picture if Ukraine actually loses the war. And since you mentioned the Poles, you know, Bronisław Geremek, who was foreign minister and Lech Wałęsa's chief negotiator in 1989, in other words, a guy who knew his business, said to me once, as foreign minister, I can say that this or that is completely unacceptable, but as a historian, I know it doesn't matter what I say as foreign minister. Stuff happens. And we better be prepared for that. And a final thought, just to foot stomp what Sandy was saying. I have some sympathy for the Biden administration's position. You know, it's caution about Ukraine's NATO membership because that's a harder call than we faced in the 90s and in the George W. Bush administration. It's tougher, but having said that, I don't see how European security is lasting without Ukraine in NATO. Otherwise, it's a gray zone. And gray zone is an invitation for Vladimir Putin, and we know what he does with invitations. That the neutral model of the Austrian State Treaty worked fine for Austria, but Putin had a neutral Ukraine before 2014. He had it, and he blew it up because he was greedy. So that doesn't work. NATO is what's left, and like it or not, I don't see a viable alternative, not for the long run.
You spoke about the Washington allegations that Eastern Europe or Central and Eastern Europe have been paranoid about the threat from Russia. So speaking of paranoia,
they were accurate, right?
I think we see from this administration maybe some what you've termed cautiousness regarding Ukraine and NATO membership, but maybe paranoia is what I would label it as such. But Ambassador Taylor, we will play the Washington talk show game, at least for one question. I would like to, we've discussed the view from Ukraine and from Europe, as well as in the earlier panels and discussions on Ukraine's NATO membership. Where does this U.S. administration and the White House stand on this question as we go into the Washington summit?
Well, they have said that Ukraine will be in NATO. That was said in Vilnius, that was said in Bucharest. But they've said it, and I believe they mean it. That is, Ukraine will be in NATO. Then your question is exactly right. What will they do this summit in July? I think they're still debating. I think they're interested in Sandy's formulation or in the Prime Minister or Yermak's formulation. I think they will have a package that they hope will fill the bill, will be adequate for this summit to move forward. I do think they're considering this question of negotiations to membership, offering that as an invitation. And I think that will happen, if not in July, sometime in the fall, sometime maybe in the later fall. I think that will happen. That is the right next step. It's a good demonstration of something that is real, that is not just rhetoric, and it will have an endpoint. I like the idea of adding the endpoint to Sandy's and others' proposal there. 20 years from Bucharest. 4 years from this summit. That's a good message that it's going to happen, and there are negotiations moving toward it. So I think that will happen.
What about the argument that we need to start looking at future-proofing or maybe Trump-proofing the NATO alliance right now for the Washington summit? Does that change the calculus 4 years from now? Where are we going to be? We, the United States.
We should do what's in our interest.
I'll be hiding in Canada, I think.
Don't go to Canada. We should do what's in our interest. It is clearly in our interest to have a peaceful Europe. The only way, as we've already discussed, the only way to have peace in Europe, security, stability in Europe, is to have a Europe whole and free. Dan coined that phrase years ago. And that's whatever happens in this country, that's what has to be our goal.
I think, Ms. Kagan, Deborah, I will ask you the last question of this first round. From a military perspective, what is still required of Ukraine to be able to join NATO? Putting aside these very political decisions, policy discussions, what steps must the Ukraine military take, or what has it already taken? And then without a membership action plan, not to get too far into the NATO weeds and wonk speak here, but without a map, which we've already moved past from the Vilnius summit, what would this mean in practice? What sorts of steps could be laid out?
So I'm gonna answer that question, and then I'm gonna go on a little rant, if that's okay.
It is the Washington talk show.
Yes. So the first part of this is Ukraine's military is already better than probably 60% of the other NATO members. Instead of just talking about budgets at 2% or 3%, we should be talking about capabilities and capacity. And there are NATO members who have been spending more than 3%, and they still don't have the capabilities and capacity to actually fight a war. So when your overhead is 70% of your budget, it really doesn't matter. So I prefer to look at capacity, capabilities, and whether your forces are usable and deployable. And Ukraine fits all of that, and a number of NATO countries do not. Ukraine can put together division and brigade headquarters. A number of NATO countries cannot without a bunch of critical enablers from the United States. So Ukraine already would be a huge and significant military add to NATO, and would put it in the tops of NATO in terms of percentages of forces, trained forces, modern battle space warfare, and the like. So I think there's not a lot that really needs to be done, because it's on-the-job training every day. And it is something that goes beyond what we do in terms of our training, which is not on the job. The second point I would make is, and I think Ms. Revlova mentioned this, a strategy of winning. The front is not stabilized. The summit is 6-7 weeks away, and I think all of this discussion is about the future. And my view is that if you do not stabilize now, there's not going to be a future. And Dan referred to some of this, but we're not doing enough to stabilize that now. And it's more than just weapons. And I think it's time, and it doesn't have to be NATO qua NATO. It could be individual countries doing their own coalition. But it is time to say that Ukraine needs help in stabilizing this front. And it's more than just sending weapons in a timely fashion. It is helping them out with logistics, helping them out with mentoring and training and advice on and intelligence sharing, but on the ground. Now, am I saying that that means that other countries should put forces at the front? Not necessarily, but if they choose to, we shouldn't say no. But there is a whole lot that goes on in the rear, and that has to do with logistics, maintenance, sustainment, intelligence fusion, and the like. And if countries, both NATO and NATO partners, would agree to do that inside Ukraine, that would take a huge burden off of the Ukrainian forces so that they can actually deploy more to the front. The second part of this is, mass should just not be defined as personnel alone. Mass should be defined on everything you bring to that battle space, and that means modern equipment and warfare, but it also means we have to stop this preoccupation with saying, oh, we're preparing for the future force of Ukraine. Well, that's just great, but if Ukraine's not here in 2 years, what are you talking about? So I would take all of that motivation and do it now to stabilize this front. I think NATO will look tremendously bad at the summit if this front is not closer to being stabilized than it is today. And that means, the hand-wringing has to stop. The chit-chat about what we can do a year from now has to stop. For example, we just did our huge supplemental. One of the contracts signed under the USAI funding will not be delivered to Ukraine to 2029. That does not help Ukraine now with stabilization, and that's what we have to focus on.
That's great. My second question to you is going to be related to what more beyond direct military aid, such as logistics, sustainment, training, can NATO allies provide to Ukraine that would be good, make good summit deliverables in policy wonk speak? I think we can come back to that too, but I did want to pose to Ms. Frolova, from your perspective as a Ukrainian and as a security expert, what does Ukraine need to defeat Russia that it's not receiving yet, that it could receive via the Washington Summit? So from a NATO format, not just bilateral aid, what can the NATO alliance do or agree to at the Washington Summit that would help Ukraine win the battle that's happening right now, not prepare for the future?
First of all, Deborah, thank you so much for your words. It's very important, and I think that not so many people can just be so bold in their words, and absolutely support with everything you said. We need to focus a lot on current situation, and because a lot of time was already lost. And about the weapons, everyone knows what we need. I don't know any war which was won when you are not attacking your enemy. Yes, we have a prohibition of using the long-range weapons and any type of serious weapons hitting our enemy at their territory. We have some objections when we use our weapons on hitting the enemy on their territory. So it doesn't work like that. I mean, with Kharkiv, it's very obvious that should we hit their concentration of forces on Russian land, we can just stop this potential offensive even before it started, but we cannot reach them. And this is one part of the problem. Yes, we need long-range weapons, we need the air superiority with different means, not only fighter jets, but also with all the other possible support in air. We still are discussing that Ukraine is not connected, for example, to Link 16, which provides the best opportunity for future fighter jets to have a reconnaissance and situational awareness. So there are small and big actions, but yes, if we're speaking about now, this is long-range weapons. This is eliminating of early limitation of usage that weapons. We already demonstrated many times that we are not targeting civilian infrastructure, that those infrastructure which is targeted, it's specifically about the military support or creating the capability for Russia to continue the war. What we need more also the presence of the United States and NATO and clear identification in the Black Sea, because the Black Sea is one of the those front opportunities where we reach a good successes and where we can develop this success. South of Ukraine is very critical. It's very critical, and the Crimea can be key to end up this war in very short-term way. And the understanding and support and focus of all the attention with all the not only forces on the ground, yes, but absolutely, Deborah was absolutely right, with intelligence, with supplies, with support of the medical facilities that can create the capabilities for Ukraine now, which we can use to release our territories. And one more time, the Black Sea and Crimea is extremely important. And we need to focus, and we need to stop project that the Crimea can be released in a military way. It should be released in a military way. There should be a clear vision what kind of operation can be done to speed up this preparation and speed up these actions from Ukrainian side.
Thank you. So I think we've laid out quite a few maybe specific capabilities or specific actions that NATO or individual allies can take to shore up the defenses of Ukraine right now and hopefully get it across this, this very difficult impasse right now. I think Ambassador Vershbow, I'd like to ask what deliverables do you think that the U.S. administration is planning for the Washington Summit related to Ukraine beyond this question of membership? So we've talked about already a little bit on the panel. There's a lot of headlines recently, just in the past few days, regarding potential trainers in Ukraine. NATO as an alliance has experience running large-scale training operations, most notably the NATO mission in Iraq. The NATO-Ukraine Council was formalized last year at the Vilnius Summit. What has been the progress of that? I actually had a hard time Googling to try and figure out what's been going on at the NATO-Ukraine Council, so would love if anyone else has any updates on that. And then another idea I've seen floated around, at least in the Twitter sphere, is transitioning the Ukraine Contact Group, which is now run by the United States, the Ramstein format, changing this into a NATO-led effort. Again, I know you've written about this recently as well, Ambassador Vershbow, but what are the sorts of things that are on the table that you think the U.S. administration would go for?
Okay, that's a kind of an open-ended question. I think that one thing that the administration, I think, is working on with a view towards unveiling it or signing it, if it's appropriate to be signed at the summit, is the U.S. version of these bilateral security agreements that were came out of the Vilnius Summit as an initiative of the G7. The British did their bilateral agreement within weeks. U.S. has kind of taken a little longer, but we obviously have to look at every comma and period. But I think that will be an important part of the larger strategy of maintaining Ukraine's security until membership becomes possible. I think the idea is that the security assistance that would be provided, possibly with additional funding attached, would kind of reinforce the Ukrainians' ability to deter and defeat Russian aggression in the short term, even though they won't have full deterrence until they have NATO membership. I think that's where there's, in my view, no doubt. Now, some of the other things that may come out of this relate to the so-called bridge, which maybe, based on what Ms. Frolova just said, needs a new name. But I think the idea that NATO will kind of integrate, accelerate all the different strands of work that have been going on in terms of preparing the country, the institutions, and the armed forces for eventual NATO membership, getting them plugged in even before membership into NATO defense planning, so that all these different forms of preparation would be coming to a head, hopefully within the time frame that membership becomes possible, and the Ukrainians would be able to kind of literally plug and play from day one, because they will have kind of done it in advance, kind of a pre-integration into the NATO integrated structures. And this could be the answer to our proposal and to the Rasmussen-Yermak proposal. But other than that, I think there'll be one other, I think, important deliverable for the summit, which relates to NATO itself, but also to Ukraine, is defense industrial base. I think NATO is looking at how they can collaborate more closely to remedy some of the clear supply chain problems that have plagued our efforts to help the Ukrainians, because we weren't preparing for a protracted war when in those halcyon days when Russia was still our partner. Clearly, there's a lot of time to be made up in that regard, and I think getting the defense industrial piece of that right will be a summit deliverable for NATO, and integrating Ukraine more with NATO industries, NATO companies, so we can have a kind of a combined NATO-Ukraine approach to developing the defense industrial base of Ukraine.
So we will have a few minutes here for questions from the audience if you would like to line up behind the microphone. We've also been taking questions online. I'm having technical difficulties with the death of my iPad. May he rest in peace, but maybe someone can read them out at the microphone if there are some good questions coming in online as well at askac.org. I did want to follow up very quickly on the question of industrial support to Deborah, if I can put her on the spot as well. I think this would be a very good summit announcement to discuss closer cooperation between NATO and Ukraine on defense industry. I think just yesterday, or maybe even just today, Elia Cohen and Ms. Forlova's boss just published in Foreign Affairs an article calling for a Western Ukrainian industrial strategy as part of a broader strategy of how to ensure Ukraine's success. What would this look like in terms of direct NATO support to Ukraine's defense industry and its native defense capacity, rather than material support?
So I think the willingness is there. I think the structure is not. And what I mean by that is the first thing you have to resolve is cooperation between the United States and European Union defense industry, which is not where it should be. There has to be more sharing, less operational security and ITAR restrictions on this in order for this to go forward. And we're still operating as if we have a whole lot of secrets from each other in that forum. And that has to change before you then can go full up to working with Ukraine. Now, having said that, there's a number of companies that are fully steeped already working with Ukraine. People have figured out workarounds. They're smart, they're clever, they're good capitalists. They know what they need to do to get things done. And they're on the ground in Ukraine, working with Ukraine industry now to help produce essential critical enablers for the Ukrainian military. There was a commitment made between Zelensky and Biden that there would be this joint venture on defense industry. It has not gotten as much traction as it should have. In fact, I think it's not gotten not nearly even a minuscule part of traction that it should have. And that needs to change, but part of it is there's still so many rules and regulations in the United States and in European capitals about what can and cannot be shared and what you can do. But there are companies that are out there, they're on the ground, they're doing maintenance and sustainment and working with Ukrainian workers on this. There's companies working with the Ukraine development on drone and counter-drone technology. And they're doing this quietly and effectively. It is not something I think that NATO should announce and say, these companies are going in there tomorrow, because then it makes everyone a target for the Russians. And then you're talking about wiping out where these industries are. So I think the way structurally this happens is to do this in a way where you don't discuss where the facilities are. You don't have huge manufacturing facilities on the ground that then become a part of a battle damage assessment. And you have to do it in a way where maybe they're in multiple locations in a smaller footprint. I think it's quite possible. I just would like to see the people in the Pentagon who are in charge of making sure things go forward quicker are more on a wartime footing and less on this peacetime footing, as if it doesn't matter and we'll just get around to it. And one other last comment on this. Some of you have heard me say this before, but the Industrial Revolution, the two industrial revolutions that the world experienced before now, took place over a 150-year period. In the battle space, we now see an industrial revolution every 2 to 3 months. And that means that what may have worked yesterday is not going to work tomorrow. So if you have people on the ground looking and can make a dynamic change, that makes your weapon systems that much more effective. It makes your joint ventures that much more effective. Because if you're just sitting back here and working on stuff and then it gets out there and it doesn't work, it's not failure, but it means you have to go back to the drawing board. And so a way to fix that is to be there, see what's going on, and make those changes on the fly.
That's a great point. I'll come back to Ambassador Taylor and Fried for another question, but we'll take an audience question. If you could introduce yourself, what organization you're representing, or yourself, and then pose your question, please.
Hi, my name is Vladislav Davidson. I am a senior fellow at this august organization. I reported for a year and a half on the front for Foreign Policy and other magazines. I have a question which requires a bit of the shortest possible preamble, so that I don't get booed out of a room. Not to talk about anything that would signal that we're not going to give NATO guarantees, not to give Moscow any kind of veto, not to send, again, bad signals to Moscow, not to scare the Ukrainians, not, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But with the difficulty and the political aspects of giving NATO status to Ukraine, shouldn't we in this room start talking about a plan B for hard security guarantees where we can fudge the difference, where we can give at least a third or 2/3 or 3/4 of a country some sort of no-fly zone or some sort of mixed security guarantees in law, so we don't have the repeat of 1994, 95, 96, where we can call it something else, but we can give Ukrainians some blanket of protection now, as opposed to theoretically 2 years from now.
And this question of providing security guarantees, tying it to different parts of the territory, not the full territory, is something that we know has been discussed in past administrations. I actually was just talking to Damon Wilson, our former colleague, 2 weeks ago, and I know this is something that he worked on in the Bush administration. How do we extend security guarantees to Georgia at that time and Ukraine? But I think I'll turn to you, Ambassador Freed, because I did want to pose a question about like past historical models that we could draw from. What would be your response to this question? How can we, what sort of arrangement can be built to secure Ukraine for right now before NATO membership, and maybe drawing on experience from the model that everyone points to of West Germany, for example?
Although the West German model is very different than security arrangements short of NATO, in the end, there's nothing short of NATO that works in the long run, because the space, the delta between whatever these improvised security arrangements are and NATO is the delta in which is a temptation to Putin, a green light or at best a yellow light. So I don't see it. But it doesn't matter what I see. That may be where we are. And you already have you have Macron, who likes to tweak the Americans by getting into this space, right? And he's right. The issue, and this is in various papers, including from the Atlantic Council, that NATO forces stationed in Poland should provide air cover to Western Ukraine, all right, is being discussed. I think that these sorts of arrangements need to be planned, because if Deborah Kagan's dark vision is right, and the Russian advance, you know, what's worst case, right? That the Russians take Kharkiv and move close to the Dnipro, okay? We'd better be damned ready to respond. And those ersatz arrangements should not be discussed in terms of theory, but in terms of actual hard practice. What are we going to do in an emergency situation where it looks like Putin could actually succeed in conquering the country? And the Biden administration probably doesn't want to talk about, they don't want to be there at the NATO summit right before the Republican National Convention. So that goes back to Deborah's point. Well, then get them the stuff now so you don't have to deal with the worst case scenarios. And I'm not, you know, I like Deborah's sense of alarm because that can spur action. Happily, I don't entirely share it, but it doesn't matter what my assessment is. We need to take seriously the immediate term and then start planning for something to take us from where we are, where we might be in a few months, to actual NATO membership.
Thank you. Please, Sandy.
I agree with that. I think this doesn't necessarily have to be looked at solely in the context of worst-case scenarios. I think there's also a danger that as other complementary steps are taken, such as these G7 bilateral agreements, and our general efforts to arm and train and expand the Ukrainian forces, some allies will say, well, isn't that all good enough? Can't we just stop and not have to cross the Rubicon of actual membership and have a big fight with the Russians? I think our answer would be, no, you may have to do things on a transitional basis. You can't just get to where you want to go necessarily in one giant leap. But if you kind of give up on the goal of NATO membership, it ultimately means the Russians will not be sufficiently deterred. And it may be some years, but they'll do it again. So Article 5 does really have this kind of decisive effect that no other measures that are being discussed, I think, would do.
At some point, the Russians could come and say, okay, if you promise that Ukraine will be neutral, we'll stop the war. That'll be their condition. At which point our answer should be, you had that chance. Ukraine was neutral. Yanukovych was on the throne, your guy, and you blew that up. So tough luck. We're not doing it again. I mean, we've had that kind of conversation with the Russians in the past over different issues. And Putin had his neutral Ukraine, and he got greedy. At which argument may be used at some point by Russians against him, but that's another conversation.
I like the joke, you know, Finlandization of Ukraine. A year ago, that was a much different conversation. I would love to Finlandize Ukraine right now, make them a member of NATO. One more audience question, and then I think we're probably going to be at time.
Anders Åslund, thank you very much. This is very illuminating, but I don't think that it's very happy outlook that we get. And I start with Sandy's presentation, which I thought was very clarifying. You have put two things that should be done in order to avoid a failure. I don't see that any of these things can be done in 1.5 months. The war is not likely to look any better in 1.5 months' time than it does now. And as Ambassador Paglioni said in the former session, it will be Germany and the US against the rest about whatever proposal that will be made to Ukraine about invitation to NATO or whatever we call it. So what can be done about this? Is the administration at all awake? And now I don't want to hear your wishful proposals, which I of course support, but what is actually likely to happen? Thank you.
Maybe I can post Ambassador Taylor first, if I can, and then maybe putting a finer point or more specific point on this.
Finer point on Anders?
What message does indecision at the Washington Summit regarding Ukraine's future membership in NATO, what message does that send to Putin?
We have to be very clear with Putin that Ukraine's going to be in NATO, and we've got some concrete steps to take, and we're taking those steps. And whether it's this invitation that Dan's talked about and that Sandy put together, or it is the combination of these bilateral agreements that actually mount up to something, add up to something, that kind of thing there. Which others, I think they can do that. I think that part they can do. And again, whether it's at this summit, whether it's in July or whether it's in November, this invitation to begin negotiations, I think that can happen too.
And the war?
Deborah, Dan, Sandy, and then Alina, in 20 seconds, a note of optimism? Anyone?
Yeah. I think there has to be, I'm not going to call it boots on the ground. I think countries from NATO have to come in now with defense contractors, whatever they want to call them, to start supporting that rear so Ukraine can do what it needs to do at the front. And then I'll say to those who think, oh, we don't want to offend Russia anymore. Russia lies. They're never going to stop lying. And they'll tell you one thing and they'll go do another thing. And anyone in the United States or in Germany who believes something other than that is taking too many legalized drugs.
An optimistic note on the war. People I respect who know more about it than I do have outlined a reasonable path to relative success, meaning if the Ukrainians can stabilize the land front, then their skill at strategic deep strikes, which have been more effective, actually, in Crimea than many people realize, become more and more important. And the Russian position can be undermined. The Russian position in Crimea, the Russian position in Kherson is vulnerable. So you could have a strategic shift, but that all depends on getting the land front stabilized. It also depends on getting the anti-aircraft stuff to Ukraine real fast. So if you're the Biden administration, for God's sakes, move quickly, because if the Ukrainians have relative success, everything shifts to the right. Otherwise, it shifts to the left this fall. Is that what you want? So they have some, I think some of them are thinking in those terms and moving fast.
And if we can go to Ukraine, and then we'll come back to Sandy. Ms. Forlova, a note of optimism, please, in 20 seconds.
Okay, the note of optimism. I should tell that I absolutely agree with the ambassador's words when he was saying that the Poland and other countries on the ground, they feel this existential threat, they know it. And it means that if the United States and Germany won't make some kind of very strategic steps towards the decisions which are expected not only by Ukraine, but many countries in Europe, we will see more rising voices of those countries, and we already saw how the configuration of decision-making in EU and other institutions has changed and how drastic their policies shifted. I think that the more the United States and Germany will insist on so soft approach, less power and influence they will have, and which means like some kind of turbulent times, but that means also rising voices of other nations, which gives a hope for another decision-making process in NATO. And I think that that should be also considered by the political power in United States. And this is about reputation, which was built up for the long period, and influence, which was built up, and national interests of the United States and Europe.
And then finally, Ambassador Vershbow, a note of optimism. The rest of the world is watching.
Yeah, it's a tough question, and I usually am an eternal optimist. But I think that, first of all, Anders Aslund is right that it's 7 weeks is asking too much to kind of bring anything to a definitive conclusion. But I do think that if the war continues to stagnate, there may be a moment of epiphany in the White House that recognizes that this is turning into the kind of the dreaded open-ended stalemate, which ultimately poses digestible decisions about boots on the ground or other direct support, and that the time has come to sort of break with the Germans, go on the diplomatic offensive inside NATO, and insist that allies look at what more can be done so we don't end up in a stalemate, which I think is maybe more likely than sort of the failure Deborah outlined, but I wouldn't rule that out either. But just thinking about a stalemate with Putin still riding high, our longer term interests are going to be severely damaged, and it'll take years to recover.
Right. I think we are at time. I know there are a few more questions from the audience. Maybe we can talk after the panel concludes. But I want to thank all of the panelists for their contributions to the discussion today. I know I learned a lot. I hope that the audience did as well. So on behalf of the Atlantic Council, thank you so much. Thank you for those tuning in online, and stay tuned for more programming related to the NATO Summit and, of course, Ukraine, a perennial important question that the Atlantic Council is working on here. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank everyone in the audience. We have, I'd say, about 80% of the folks who started with us three plus hours ago. I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching us virtually. To give you some incentive to watch us in the future, the ideas that are now very much in play about offering Ukraine NATO accession membership, we presented at an event here last October. And for one issue we haven't really discussed today, but is very important, are the frozen Russian state assets. There's now serious conversation in the G7 about using at least the interest from those assets to transfer to Ukraine. We did an event here in March of last year, which talked about something more ambitious than that, which is in play. So if you want to see the future, stay with us, because today we present the future. Thank you all.